Well, hello everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations. This is the land upon which the Melbourne Law School stands, so we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend a welcome to those who have Indigenous heritage here with us today. My name is Margaret Young. I'm a professor here at Melbourne Law School, and I'm also director of our Institute for International Law and the Humanities, IILAH. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting with the Melbourne Centre for Law and the Environment, which Associate Professor Rebecca Nelson runs. She's here as well today. So we've combined forces because the topic is of interest to both of our research centres. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kathleen Auld, who's actually an alumni from Melbourne Law School, so we're delighted to have her back in the city. Kathleen is lecturer in ocean sustainability, governance and management at the World Maritime University, which is in Malmö, Sweden, and which is an initiative of many organisations, including the International Maritime Organisation. So it's quite a unique university that combines that international organisational background. So as part of her role there, Kathleen researches but also delivers capacity building workshops and lectures in her area of interest. She's also project officer of CAPFISH, which is a project of the International Maritime Organisation. So she brings her research background. She did a PhD at the University of Cape Town, an LLM here at Melbourne Law School, and before that a BA LLB from Cape Town. So she's a lawyer with all of these other interests, and it's great to hear her speak on a topic that's very close to my heart, because actually I came to Fisheries Subsidies very early on in my research career as somebody who was interested in international law's fragmentation, in the way we have different regimes like trade, law of the sea, fisheries management, all seemingly trying to work together, but with very different mandates, very different constituent bodies, member states, and very different resource levels, locations, and modus operandi, institutional cultures and blind spots. So how international law fits together amongst this proliferation of different international institutions is particularly fraught when you think about how international law is meant to be undergirded by state consent, but yet it's also meant to be able to address issues of global concern, like fisheries decline, like the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity decline and pollution. So do we have a functioning international legal order that can address these things, given we have such desperate regimes? Fisheries subsidies, I think, is a really interesting topic, because it's trying to bring in disciplines from the trade regime to help address fisheries management issues, which have been really missed and haven't had the institutional capacity for many, many years, in part because it works for states to just build up their vessel capacity and go out and fish those ships, those fish, even when from an ecological perspective it is crazy to do so. So we're really much looking forward to Kathleen's views on this topic. She'll speak for about 40 minutes and we'll then have about 20 minutes for questions. Thanks very much. Kathleen.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back at Melbourne Law School. And as Margaret mentioned, today I will be talking about a topic which I've also been working on for quite some time. I was thinking the other day about how long it's been since I was at Melbourne Law School, and it's been 9 years. And that was the year where I was doing my master's and got really interested in the fisheries subsidies, in large part because of Margaret's work, particularly on this issue, the books that she wrote, and so this seems like the perfect place to come and talk about this issue. And specifically in this presentation, I want to interrogate this rhetoric and this idea that has been present since the beginning of the negotiations, that these negotiations can achieve a triple win for environment, development, and trade. Okay, so you may be asking yourself what on earth this idea of a triple win is. Of course, it's a win-win-win situation. And this triple win concept is used in many different industries, but when we talk about it in an environment development context, what we're really talking about is a win for the economy, a win for the environment, and a win for social and development factors. And triple wins, of course, are not about trade-offs as much as they are about synergies and complementarities. We are looking at projects or policies that can deliver benefits in all three of these areas. And for those of you who are interested in trade, this might seem a bit of a strange concept because what often happens in trade policy, even though free trade liberalisation is often seen as, or it's often touted as having developmental benefits, in reality, what we often see is that the trade policies that come out of the WTO and regional trade organizations do have negative externalities for environmental trade or environmental development. You may not remember, but of course there was a famous case of that farmer who lit himself on fire outside the WTO to protest the agricultural subsidies which were being allowed by the WTO, and knock-on negative effects for developing country farmers. So this WTO agreement is quite rare in that trading system, in that there is this possibility, or at least this possibility is touted, of a triple win. So a win not just for trade, but also for environment and development. And this rhetoric has been used throughout the negotiations. You can see there the former Director General of the WTO noting that reducing fisheries subsidies could significantly reduce overfishing, foster species preservation, thereby constituting a triple win. More recently, actually, after the conclusion of the WTO agreement in 2022, the Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission noted that the successful implementation of the agreement by all WTO members would help secure the livelihoods of the 260 million people who depend on marine fisheries. And another interesting perspective is, of course, provided by academia. So back in 2013, of course, as academics, we tend to be a bit more cynical about these things. And back in 2013, there was this very interesting article written about this idea of the triple win and how member states use this rhetoric to position their arguments in a way that highlights how prioritizing environmental and social dimensions of liberalisation, can be achieved in the WTO. And their view is that this is actually really important for the survival of the WTO because of its poor reputation for negative externalities to trade and environment. So in this presentation, I really want to interrogate two elements of this rhetoric. Firstly, the idea that trade liberalisation, in this case, the banning of fishery subsidies, can have environmental and developmental benefits. So that's the first assumption. And the second assumption is that the WTO agreement can actually achieve a triple win, or has actually achieved a triple win. So those are the two assumptions that are made, that are inherent in this idea, and that's what I want to kind of keep in mind to frame the presentation as we go forward. So the first question is, why are fishery subsidies seen as potentially having, or the banning of fishery subsidies, I should say, are seen as potentially leading to environmental and developmental benefits? And the reason for that is that fishery subsidies are unique in the world of subsidies, or the world of domestic input subsidies, in that they affect not only the production of fish, so not only how much fish we can catch, not only the price that we can sell that fish for, but also the supply of fish, because of course, this is support which is being provided for a finite resource, a resource which can be depleted. Of course, the depletion of fish has knock-on effects for others who would like to fish that resource, and also for future generations. So that's where the environmental character of fishery subsidies comes in. And of course, fishery subsidies are not a monolith. They can be described in different ways. And because of this environmental character, they have been separated into different categories based on their effect on the sustainability of the resource. So for example, beneficial subsidies have benefits for sustainability of fish stocks. That includes things like fisheries management. Capacity enhancing subsidies, which are those we're going to mostly be talking about in this presentation and are really the subject of the WTO Agreement, are those subsidies which have negative sustainability effects for fish stocks. And those include subsidies such as vessel construction, vessel modernization, fishing inputs such as fuel, ice, bait, etc. Anything which puts more vessels on the water and keeps them on the water, fishing and overfishing. And unfortunately, the majority of the estimated 35 billion US dollars of subsidies that are provided annually are these capacity enhancing subsidies. And so these subsidies have a number of negative effects. Of course, it's in the name, they increase overcapacity in the fishing industry. That leads to overfishing. And there's also been links drawn between the provision of fisheries subsidies and illegal, unreported, and unregulated. A big problem with these subsidies is that they also make distant water fishing possible. A lot of distant water fishing would not be possible without these types of input subsidies, particularly fuel subsidies. And these distant water fishing fleets are quite notorious for overfishing and also engaging in illegal fishing. There was this very interesting study done by Dihya Habib and her colleagues, and I would encourage everyone to read it. But it was a 2015 study where they looked at the effects of distant water fleets from the European Union and also from China on fish stocks in the waters of West Africa. There's a lot of distant water fishing that goes on under access agreements in the waters of West Africa. And what they found was that there was significant illegal fishing taking place by these fleets. You can see here, thereby undermining the resource and leading to all sorts of problems with food and livelihood insecurity for the fisheries and the fishers who were topped those fisheries. So that's a significant issue. And then, of course, like any subsidies, fishery subsidies lead to unfair competition, they lead to market distortion. And as I said, there are all these knock-on effects in food and livelihood insecurity. So these are some of the negative effects that we see from capacity enhancing subsidies and why it's quite important to have these disciplines on these subsidies. Now, just to give you a sort of visual idea of the unfair competition and the inequalities that are caused by fisheries subsidies. We can see here, I don't know if you can read this, but this is a graph of subsidies that are given and broken down by region. So here we have the Asian region, given by far the most subsidies over here. China is over here, because it is the world's largest subsidizer. Europe is over here, and then we also have North America. But North America is giving, as you can see, more beneficial subsidies than capacity enhancing subsidies. On the other end of the scale, the smaller subsidizers, Africa, South Central America, and the Caribbean, and actually Oceania. So Oceania has low levels of subsidies, not necessarily because Australia and New Zealand in particular can't afford to give subsidies to the fishing industry. This is actually a choice. This is a choice not to give significant subsidies to the fishing industry. And this is pretty admirable. You can see here the massive unfair competition that's being caused to the fleets from these regions compared to the fleets from these regions, which are having all their costs subsidized. On the other hand, we also see massive inequalities sectorally. So the small scale sector is receiving far less in the way of subsidies compared to the large scale sector. So again, the small scale fisheries are subject to massive unfair competition. They don't have the same fishing inputs. They're just not getting their costs subsidized in the same way, which means that they can't compete on markets and they can't compete for access to the resource. I also want to draw attention to the relative impacts of fisheries subsidies, because this is not something which is discussed very much, but there's been sort of interesting research on this recently. So there's a lot of focus on the 8 largest subsidizers: China, European Union, United States, South Korea, Japan, Russia, Thailand, and Indonesia. You will notice there are quite a few developing countries on that list, which will be important when we talk about the WTO Agreement. But there's a lot of focus on these subsidizers. They provide over 65% of total global subsidies. So the feeling is that if we can reduce the subsidies in these countries, we can solve a lot of the problems. We can significantly reduce global subsidies. However, if we're looking at subsidy amounts in a relative sense, and I mean, I'm not saying it's not important to focus on these subsidizers, but we also should not discount smaller subsidizers. Because if we look at the amount of subsidies given relative to the proportion of landed catch, we can see that the graph looks a lot flatter, right? And the effect of this is that smaller subsidizers, even though they're not giving so much in the way of subsidies globally, can still cause significant negative environmental and socioeconomic effects in their local fisheries. And very good examples here are the subsidized canoe fleets that we see in West Africa. So Senegal, Ghana, and this is by no means unique to this region, but these canoe fleets have been heavily subsidized. They are small-scale fisheries technically, but because they are giving massive subsidies, these subsidies are leading actually to significant negative effects. And I just actually want to talk briefly about the case of Ghana in this regard, because one of my students from this year, from the Ghana Navy, wrote a really interesting dissertation on the effects of the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies on small-scale fisheries in Ghana. And he came up with some really interesting findings. So Ghana's small-scale fleets consist primarily of these wooden dugout canoes, as you can see here. It is an absolutely massive fleet at this point. It employs 110,000 fishers, supporting coastal livelihoods and food security, and of course creating additional jobs. However, this fleet over the years has become more and more heavily subsidized. There's been investments into the mechanization of boats, the building of boats, and also there's been these really massive premix fuel subsidies given to the sector. And so this has led to, of course, increases in mechanization and the size of canoes, and the continuing subsidization of fishing inputs. In addition to this, has been a major factor in the overexploitation of small pelagic stocks in this region. So I think up until this point, we can see that this idea, this case study, really fits the narrative of the triple win, that, you know, fishery subsidies do have these significant environmental and developmental negative effects on environmental development. But when my student interviewed the fishers in the region, the government officials in the region, he found something very interesting, that these subsidies, well, initially, you know, and initially building up the industry and contributing to the overexploitation of stocks, have now become a lifeline for these communities because the stocks are overexploited and because they rely on them. And removing those subsidies would, of course, cause significant hardship. What he also discovered was that the government had, in fact, had a case where there had been significant illegal fishing happening, illegal live fishing happening in a certain area. And the government had said, okay, well, we're going to withdraw these subsidies as a punishment. And far from actually changing that behavior, the behavior didn't change at all, and in fact, it got worse. Because these communities still needed to live, and without the subsidies, there was even more incentive to engage in illegal fishing. And I think this is by no means unique to Ghana, because in the fishing industry in general, subsidies have been so heavily embedded for so long that their removal can also have negative environmental effects and negative development effects. And We can't overlook that when we are considering how to remove these fisheries subsidies. And I think this is a little bit where the rhetoric around the triple win falls apart, because this idea is that because the fisheries subsidies lead to negative environmental and developmental outcomes, removing those subsidies will have positive environmental developmental outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily track when we look at real world examples when we consider the issue in practice. So that then brings us to the WTO Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, and the consideration of whether this agreement, in fact, the way it is set up, does have these environmental and developmental benefits in addition to trade benefits, whether this agreement can actually be said to achieve a triple win. Just to give you a quick overview of the timeline of the subsidy negotiations and where we currently stand. The negotiations began all the way back in 2001, and we only got an agreement in 2022. So that was 21 years of negotiations to reach this agreement there. And for the first few years, they just decided whether or not they were, well, they negotiated on whether they were going to negotiate, essentially. But in 2005, they finally agreed to properly negotiate this agreement. The chair released his first draft in 2007. And at this point, it looked like the negotiations were on track to conclude. But this draft was seen to massively favor the interests of developed countries. And developed countries got upset, they pushed back on it. And so the negotiations then stalled in 2011. And then various events catalyzed the eventual conclusion of the agreement. So in 2015, Sustainable Development Goal 14.6 was adopted. And this goal notes that the World Trade Organization should by 2020 prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies. In addition, there were a couple of really big regional trade agreements which entered into force during this time. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership and the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, both of which had some limited bans on fisheries subsidies. And all of this catalyzed eventually the adoption of the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies in 2022. However, this agreement is not complete. So there was one very important ban left out of this agreement. And that is now the subject of ongoing negotiations. So this agreement, this AFS agreement, essentially it's prohibits the use of certain fishery subsidies based on the behavior of vessels. So if vessels are engaging, for example, in illegal fishing, if they're fishing overfished stocks, then subsidies can't be provided to those vessels. But what this further provision would have done is in fact to just ban certain subsidies outright. So not based on the behavior of vessels, just ban them outright. And those were the subsidies which were deemed to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, such as fuel subsidies, such as boat construction subsidies. So we're not really going to get a chance, unfortunately, to talk about these ongoing negotiations in this presentation because we don't have the time. But I am happy to talk about, if anyone's interested in talking about those negotiations, I have read all the drafts that have been released so far, so I'm happy to talk about that later on. So going to the WTO Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, this agreement covers marine wild capture fishing, but it excludes aquaculture and inland fishing. It also covers fisheries related activities. Fishing-related activities at sea, I should say. So these are activities such as resupply vessels. So, distant water fishing vessels, they're fishing on the high seas. Often they will have vessels that, resupply them with fuel and so on. Or there will be carrier vessels which come and take the fish that they've caught and land in a port. So it's also covering those activities, which is very important because that's part of the full fishing operation, and also some of these activities can lead to IUU fishing as well. The agreements also make subsidies attributable to the member providing them. Again, this is very important because This helps to bypass flags of convenience arrangements. So I don't think this map is actually completed on the screen, but in any case, no problem. There was this notorious example of this IUU vessel called the FB Viking. This vessel during its lifetime had 10 different flags. It just flag topped all over the place. And obviously it used, this practice to obscure its activities and its ultimate beneficial owner. And so this is a massive problem in fisheries. And so this agreement gets around it by basically saying that subsidies should be attributable to the member providing them. And then finally, an important issue is that government payments under fisheries access agreements are not deemed to be subsidies. Remember, we spoke earlier about, countries fishing in other countries' waters. That's under these access agreements. And you may think that this is obvious, that these will not be subsidies, because subsidies are defined in this agreement as financial contributions by a government to an industry, not by a government to a government. And so it seems kind of obvious that these payments would not be deemed to be subsidies, but this provision is actually, it seems to be something of a signal based on, what happened in the previous negotiations, that countries want to have access agreements excluded, access agreements and the potential for access subsidies to also be excluded from this agreement. Access subsidies being when the government, after securing the access rights, then passes them on to the fishing industry, and the fishing industry is not reimbursed them. So this, I think, is a little bit of a problem, considering what we talked about earlier, the effects of distant water fishing, the negative effects of distant water fishing on environmental development. Now, the heart of the WTO agreement is the bans on fisheries subsidies. There are three major bans in this agreement. The first one is the ban on subsidies to vessels or operators engaging in IUU fishing, or legal unreported and unregulated fishing. Now, in order to fall under this ban, there has to be an affirmative determination of IUU fishing by a coastal state, a flag state, or a regional fisheries management organization. Now, I don't know for sure, but given past practice by RFMOs, which do keep IUU vessel lists, I assume that coastal states and flag states under this agreement will do something similar. They will also have an IUU vessel list. These IUU vessel lists maintained by RFMOs are quite limited. And the process to put fishing vessels on them is quite bureaucratic and political. And so these lists are limited and they cover really only a fraction of IUU fishing. And so if this is the approach that's going to be adopted by coastal states and flag states, which I think will be necessary, given that there are certain procedural fairness provisions in this agreement, that is potentially a problem in terms of the scope of this provision. It seems to narrow this provision quite a lot. The second ban is on subsidies for the fishing of overfished stocks. And stocks are considered to be overfished based on best scientific evidence available to a coastal state or RFMO. Now note the wording there, the best scientific evidence available to a coastal state or RFMO. This is not the best scientific evidence available, full stop. Right, so this is a weaker standard than we might otherwise have wanted from an environmental perspective. And this article also has an important exception, which notes that if a country has management measures in place, the member has management measures in place to rebuild a stock to biologically sustainable levels, then they are allowed to maintain subsidies to vessels targeted with these stocks. And this provision also seems like a little bit of a loophole, considering the way it's worded. We'll see how it's applied in practice. But the way it's worded, there doesn't seem to be any requirement to show that these, these management measures to rebuild the stocks are actually working. It's just that you need to have them in place. And I think another issue which we need to be cognizant of is the fact that the countries that are able to maintain such management programs are going to be the wealthier countries, the largest subsidizers, not small and developing countries. So there is potentially a dichotomy there, and when it comes to development as well as environment. And both of these provisions have a 2-year exemption for all developing countries, the largest subsidizers and the small developing countries within their EEZs. And then finally, there is a ban on subsidies on fishing in unregulated high seas areas. And what this means is a little bit unclear. We don't know how it's going to be interpreted. So, if we look at the coverage, for example, of RFMOs, these are the general RFMOs, these are the tuna RFMOs. We can see that they are covering a huge proportion of the high seas already. So the question is this article just applying to those very small areas that are not technically covered by any sort of management organization? Or is this going to be interpreted in a broader sense, that, for example, they technically are covering these areas, or they're technically covering, for example, the tuna RFMOs are only covering certain species. And so, in effect, certain species in that area are not actually regulated, or, the enforcement and management regulations are not sufficient, and so they're not properly regulated. These are issues which we don't know how it's going to be interpreted. Probably we will have to wait for some sort of adjudication under this agreement to fully understand the scope of this provision and how wide it actually is going to be. And there are a couple of other provisions in here, which are what I like to call best efforts provisions. So they're not mandatory. They just ask countries to use due restraint and special care when providing subsidies to vessels flying a different flag, or subsidies to unassessed stocks. Again, I think this one on unassessed stocks is a missed opportunity, particularly if we're looking at distant water fishing again, and the fact that most of the distant water fishing that happens in the waters of other countries happens in the waters of coastal developing states. So it's developed states paying for access to the waters of coastal developing states, many of which are not able to properly assess their stocks. And so not having a specific ban on, subsidies to unassessed stocks is potentially problematic from that perspective. Once again, we see that distant water fishing is not very well regulated. And then a few other provisions I just want to draw your attention to. The technical assistance provisions are quite robust in this agreement compared to other WTO agreements. They actually have a fisheries funding mechanism they've set up, which does allow for countries to, or members to make contributions into the fund to help developing countries implement the agreement. They have set up a Fisheries Subsidies committee as well to monitor the implementation of the agreement. They are enhanced notification provisions beyond what's in the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which is also really important considering that fishery subsidies up to this point have been notoriously not notified to the WTO. And then there's also some dispute settlement provisions in there, which are very much along the lines of the current dispute settlement provisions applicable to subsidies. There's also a provision which allows for exemptions for subsidies to disaster relief for natural disasters, which allow for restoration of the fishery to pre-disaster levels. And very importantly, there is a sunset clause. Remember, I told you that this is only half an agreement, it's not concluded yet. And this clause is essentially meant to galvanize countries or members into negotiating a full agreement, negotiating that additional provision that I talked about, and creating comprehensive disciplines. Because if not, the agreement will terminate 4 years after entry into force. All right, so that brings me back around to the initial question of the triple win, and whether this is realistic, whether this is idealistic, whether the WTO agreement actually represents a triple win, and whether this is actually a realistic goal for this agreement. So I think that the agreement on fisheries subsidies has some benefits in each of these areas, trade, environment, and development. But these come with certain caveats. So from the trade perspective, of course, we have bans on certain fisheries subsidies. So we are getting a certain amount of trade liberalisation here. And of course, we also have increased scrutiny and transparency of fisheries subsidies through enhanced notification requirements. From an environmental perspective, these bans deal with the worst types of fishery subsidies, what are widely acknowledged to be the worst types. The subsidies going to practices like illegal fishing. And as I mentioned, the agreement also covers the whole fishing operation and circumvents the flag of convenience problem. And on the development side, there's reduction of subsidies overall that creates greater fairness, given that we have such inequality in the provision of fishery subsidies at the moment, regionally and sectorally. There's also some time-based exemptions for developing countries and fairly strong technical assistance provisions. And we also have that exemption for disaster relief. So these are some of the benefits in each of these areas for this agreement. But as I mentioned, these come with some major caveats. So in the trade sector, in the trade section, I mean, the bans are fairly narrow at the moment. We, of course, don't have this additional wider provision banning certain types of fishery subsidies deemed to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. This may change once we have these comprehensive disciplines, but right now they're very narrow. And also, as I said, this will depend to some extent on interpretation. From the environmental side, as I've mentioned several times, subsidies to distant water fishing, which is a significant problem, are largely not dealt with. And of course, subsidies driving overcapacity and overfishing. The majority of the fishery subsidies that are being given today are not being dealt with. Only very narrow types of subsidies are being dealt with. And some of these issues I've also mentioned in the explanation. So Article 3 relies on IEU determinations of RFMOs, which, as I've said, have been limited. And then the management provisions in Article 4 and also Article 5 are not particularly robust, in my opinion. And another issue which is not really talked about very much is that the dispute settlement provisions, because they are very much along the line of other agreements, which are, set up to deal with trade, and these dispute settlement provisions are also set up to deal with trade policies, trade agreements. They are actually in many ways likely insufficient for the enforcement of environmental provisions for various reasons. I think the main one being that it's often difficult to tie trade effects from these from the fishery subsidies to a specific country or a specific state. And then finally, on the development perspective, special and differential treatment in this agreement in any case is pretty limited for developing countries. There's also no specific exemptions for small-scale fisheries. This is just for developing countries for a short period of time. And the agreement does very little to reduce unfair competition, in my opinion. It actually largely maintains the status quo, partly because of these exemptions. For example, the exemption allowing for subsidies to overfish stocks if you have a management system in place, partly because there's no differentiation between different types of developing countries in these exemptions and so on. And there's also no relief from economic disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic. What we did see in that pandemic was that it massively affected the fishing industry, because fisheries have very long value chains in the sense that fish may be caught in one place, processed in another place, sold somewhere else. And when you cut off that trade, of course, that did cause a significant hardship for fishers. Restaurants were also closed. That was another issue. And one of the biggest oversights in this agreement is that it doesn't really include any exemptions for social protection. So those are things like subsidies for safety at sea, subsidies for working conditions, ensuring working conditions are good at sea, subsidies for income protection in, when there's closed seasons, when there's management measures put in place which limit how much can be caught. And the reason I say this is a massive oversight is because the fishing industry is quite notorious for having very poor working conditions and safety conditions. And not only on the illegal fishing vessels, which are the worst and often have forced labor, human trafficking, a lot of these types of very, very severe human rights violations, but even in, the regular fishing industry, often the labor conditions and the safety conditions are extremely poor. So this really is a massive oversight. Was not included in this agreement at all. Okay, so ultimately, if we are going to look at these assumptions that I raised earlier, I think there's two important questions we need to ask ourselves. Firstly, does the AFS represent a triple win? So you may have a different view on this based on what I've said, but for me, I don't believe it does. I think that, yes, the trade provisions are very narrow, but even, okay, so even assuming that the reduction of fishery subsidies can lead to environmental and developmental benefits. I'm not sure we can make that assumption, but assuming that is the case, the way that it's structured is that the trade bans that are in place, the subsidy bans that are in place are qualified to a large extent by exemptions, which tend to undermine the environmental and developmental benefits, however minor they may be, of those subsidy reductions, as I've already discussed. The second question is, was a triple win ever a realistic goal? So I've been a bit hard on the subsidies agreement this whole presentation, but at the end of the day, a plan is better than no plan, an agreement is better than no agreement. This agreement does take a step in the right direction when it comes to addressing fisheries subsidies. But the problem is that if you put this kind of pressure, I suppose, on it to be a triple win, to automatically have these environmental and developmental benefits without more, then it's going to fail, because this is only one policy in what should be a toolbox of policy when it comes to fisheries management. You have to situate the reduction of subsidies within wider fisheries management context. As we saw in the case of Ghana, if you want to reduce fisheries subsidies, you may also have to find a way to offset the hardships, for example, on coastal communities. You can maybe channel those subsidies into alternative livelihoods or other developmental benefits. You may also have to put in stronger fisheries management provisions to rebuild the stocks, so the fishers don't need those subsidies to survive. And so you can't just automatically assume that reducing fishery subsidies without anything else is going to lead to benefits for environment and development. And countries, when they implement this agreement, are going to have to wrestle with those realities. So having said that, I'm happy to take questions. I'm also happy to hear your opinions if you disagree with me. I think it's certainly open for debate. So yeah, so please feel free to share your opinions on it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for that great overview of this new agreement. It's not yet entered into force.
No, I should have mentioned that.
It's still got to get the requisite number of states on board, the WTO members who will sign on, but the trajectory is upwards. But obviously, people are looking not just at that entry into force, but whether the next agreement is likely to be negotiated. Well, I think we'll have to finish there, but Kathleen will be around for a few minutes after if people have direct questions that they want to take up with her. But I think you'll agree that that's really a very learned account of a very complicated area. So I don't know that anyone, at least in my circle, could deliver such an account. So I'm very grateful that you gave us your time, Kathleen, and also responded to our questions. So please join me in Kathleen.